right, welcome back to Chasing Squirrels. I am happy to say I'm sitting here with a fantastic educator. I have a backstory as to how we first met, and maybe I'll throw that down at some point. And fortunate to be able to reach out and kind of create what I'll say is kind of like, I guess, an organic meeting, quick messages, use Twitter, social media, get to a table and get to a conversation that I think is both timely and a key conversation that more educators, I hope, are having in their schools, in their school boards, with their colleagues, digital and otherwise. So without further ado, I am here with Sivanesan. And Sanji, could you throw down your own intro?
Sure.
I feel lazy every time I say that, but your own introduction.
No, I like that challenge. Hello, I'm Sanji. My proper Tamil name is Sanjeevan, but it's been anglicized, and that's part of my identity. So with that, there you go. I am an immigrant to this land that's called Canada, and I'm cisgender male, gay, I guess coming up on middle age. Yes, I'm an educator, but I'm also an individual trying to, make sense of this world and leave it better than I've found it. I am privileged in many ways, and one of them is, being able to do what I do, and all the. It is a calling, yes, being an educator, but the responsibility is a great one, and I'm thankful for so many things. One of them is the responsibilities I've been allowed through our board, York Region District School Board, and I take that very seriously, and always reflect on that in terms of impact of what I do and what I bring to our learners and to our system, and also my colleagues. So again, trying to think about how do I leave the world as is a better place than I found it, for those that are in it of it.
I love introductions that kind of blow my list of questions out of the water. It's sort of, and I only mean by the things that I'm curious about in our discussion. I like when whatever starting point I thought I could get to, I don't know if I can start there anymore. And that's a positive thing for me. Sure. Because that I think is one way to kind of assess if you're on the right track in a conversation, if you feel kind of invigorated and slightly surprised. Not that I'm looking to sort of surprise and zig or zag necessarily, but I appreciate it when that happens to me. I know some of the pieces that you've spoken to, how you identify, from, in at least your Twitter profile. Mm-hmm. And one of the words in there that always catches my curiosity, and I guess it's something I was meaning to ask you, but I believe in there you said you're a pluralist. Mm-hmm. And I'm sometimes I gotta admit, like sometimes I go right to Google and I try and get the definition, right? I want to lock it down, like it's sort of like. But then there's other times I'm like, I feel like this might be better addressed from a different perspective, mm-hmm. as in yours. Mm-hmm. What importance does that identity hold for you? What does that? What is the power? What is the sort of the point of view? What does that mean to you to be a pluralist?
Good question. I would have to say that pluralism, or that shift towards pluralism, is really recent. When I first started in this role as a curriculum consultant about 4 years ago, we did a bit of a survey in one of the cognitive coaching sessions, where you sort of self-identify based on statements, and having just come from being a department head of English and literacy lead, I ended up being an academic rationalist, and I prided myself on that. I may not have known that's what it was called, but again, my stance was that, right? Academic rationalism, and That's where you prioritize literature and canon and merit and standards, because we need to have those things, right? And what it means to be a learned person. And being in this role, and especially putting equity and anti-oppression work in the center, has enabled me to question that. And that pluralism comes out of that there is no neutral academic rationalism. It is a particular worldview that is, related to a particular culture and worldview as well. But it, on the surface, it's marketed or it's perceived as neutral or as erudite, all those things. So all those privileged markers that go with that notion of academic rationalism. So whereas pluralism, espouses the notion that there are many views, there's no one way of looking at things that is credible or neutral or value-free. And that's a huge shift for me. Especially, embodying the social identities that I embody, as I said, being an immigrant, being South Asian, Sri Lankan, gay, cisgender. I'm also able-bodied. I speak English and Tamil and not French. I'm of middle-class background. So all those identities enable me to have a view that is, a multiple perspective, and academic rationalism isn't it. And the other part of that is, academic rationalism prioritizes curriculum and, as I said, texts and authors, which begs the question, what about the reader, right? What about the learner? What of them? What of their needs and aspirations and interests? And gifts and talents, and that's been my journey, and that's been reflecting back now. As I say, reflecting back that that being academic rationalist had consequences, for better or for worse, on my learners, on myself, on my practice. So I believe the pluralism now, I think, is a good way of capturing my shift towards that truth, in quotations, that there are multiple ways of being in the world, seeing the world, and responding to the world. So I always try to operate from that, what am I missing? What am I not seeing? What are my filters? And what are other potentialities and possibilities exist? Does that answer your question?
Absolutely. Okay. And and this, as I'm listening to the layers, as I'm sort of like existing in your layers, my mind is like, yeah, Clough, that's why you don't go to Google to some things. Mm-hmm. That's why you need to sort of connect with the person or connect with the community and sort of kind of find out, because that's a wonderful perspective. Like, I can't ask for any. I don't think anyone could ask for any more of sort of like that the why. And I am curious to go ahead, jump in.
No, I was going to say, well, you know what? That is sort of a self acquired or moniker or philosophy, and that can be quite biased and distinct from the dictionary definition. Right, but that I felt, based on my lived experience, pluralism captures the essence of what I believe and stand for now. Mm-hmm. But again, it can be completely different from what it's meant to be, from a philosophical, knowledge perspective.
What's, for me to sort of to play off that, mm-hmm. I get the sense that part of this discovery, part of this noticing in yourself, mm-hmm. that there's a path up to it. There's a sort of like a 1.0 version of you that sort of like, there was a necessary starting point in order to sort of figure out that you're no longer in faculty anymore. It's, you know, and for some other educators I've talked to, they use that kind of as a starting point, as in that first door they walk through to sort of identify themselves as an educator, as a teacher, as someone that was going to work in education. They hold a lot of credit to the things that they were taught in faculty. It becomes the starting point, the eye-opening point, the beginning of, let's say, the journey. Somewhere between that and where you are right now, how did you notice that you were either changing in your sort of perspective? Because it sounds like not only this to be a personal identification, but there's a professional element to it as well. Your perspective on, as you mentioned, you know, the impact on the classroom, impact on self, impact on community. Was there something in there that shifted you, or is it a lot smoother than that? As in, you know, you're just kind of here, like you're sort of on this journey, and now as I ask you the question, you can answer it. But was there kind of like, I don't want to reduce it to a moment, but where you noticed that what you were introduced to, let's say at faculty, or the student that you were that was becoming the teacher, you realized, I'm kind of letting go of some of those pieces in order to sort of take on these new ways of thinking. The reason that I asked, and I'll completely front load this, is that there are other, I'll say educators because primarily that's who I talk to, that are looking to create change within their sort of sphere. They want to bring what they're noticing is now like their new authentic identity, whatever it is, and they're trying to figure out how do I pivot? Is it even a pivot, right? And sometimes in noticing it, you create a barrier that isn't actually there. It's just you taking a snapshot. Whereas if you just kept on doing what you're doing, you would have arrived at the exact same place.
Right.
Was there a noticeable moment, though, in your process of understanding yourself, or sort of like recreating yourself, or sort of even just noticing who you were becoming in education, that became the shift, and you're like, no, I think I'm like kind of going in this direction now?
Right. I would say it's I guess, a mixture of a few things. One of them being your colleagues, right? Who, again, those come into this role as consultants, you know, high caliber, you know, highly effective instructors who's got the pedagogy down, but also they're always reflecting as, again, you know, effective practitioners, reflecting, they're self-correcting. And it's and that's sort of a culture that does permeate, I think, curriculum, and especially the folks that I've worked with, which in turn influence you to do that as well, right? That, and the second part of it is that free of the confines of the classroom and the school, there's some impetus and opportunity to let go of some of those legacies that you are bound by. Because curriculum, you know, there is some autonomy, and there's some, you know, trust in, okay, you've sort of proven yourself as an educator. Now, how do you want to be part of the shift? So I think that opportunity to think about your own practice, but also think about and be critical of what goes on in the classrooms. So that's the other one, and I think. One of the reasons I think I was such an academic rationalist, and you know, and all the challenges and advantages that came with that, was that as a racialized, you know, English as a second language learner, as I mentioned, I was an immigrant to this country. I think at the core of some of my practice was predicated on, you know, what I now understand it to be that imposter syndrome. That you know, you an immigrant, English is your second language. You know, you're a department head or your literacy lead. So you're always, you know, thinking to yourself, how are you good enough to do this? How are you here, right? So to perhaps contradict or you know, minimize that sort of self-doubt, that, you know, imposter feeling, you're always wanting to present the best version of yourself, and that version of yourself to the world is sometimes as very rigid, demanding, or having high expectations, so that you can't be questioned. You can't be, right? Because I'm by the book. I am reproducing what it means to be an English instructor, right? That is to have mastered Shakespeare and the British canon and even CanLit, right? Because that was my major, CanLit and Canadian history, right? But of course, little did I recognize, or perhaps I recognized, but wasn't willing to admit, was that the erasure of Indigenous voices in CanLit, in Canadian history, colonization and genocide of British colonialism, right? Having come from Sri Lanka. So I was always sort of grappling with those, and in order to claim my space as a department head, as a literacy lead, as an English teacher, I felt that I had to reproduce and use those legacy beliefs and practices and ideologies to stake my claim, my validity, right, in that role, right, lest I be challenged, scrutinized, as I mentioned. And it may very well be that was my perception, and that's how I, explained it to myself. Maybe that wasn't really the case, right? But that's how I perceived my reality and responded in that way. But I'm now inclined to think that there was some of that, right? When you walk into a room, right, you're read as how others perceive you. Labels are put on you, right? So there are expectations that come with that, right? So you're having to always, prove yourself, in other words. So I think, reflecting back on that, it was, wreaking cost to myself, but also to my students, who there were indications that they saw me as unapproachable, saw me as, prioritizing content and texts over them, right? But again, in terms of that discipline, that's what you had to do. I'm here to teach you English, right? Whereas my elementary colleagues would often say, I teach kids, right? But in secondary, right, we claim, we are the calculus teacher, where I'm the 12U teacher, I'm the AP teacher, right? So those roles, you internalize, right, and you reproduce, and then you lose that human connection. And a purpose of education is to transform lives, to connect students to potential and passion, right? So I think there were already cracks in that perception of myself, and then, but again, having come into this role, and the department and the kind of work we were doing in terms of collaboration with colleagues, I think really, continue to destroy that part of myself. That's not to say I still, have moments of academic rationalism where I feel like that's my default. So I have to really fight against that, right? And that, to be pluralist, to really wonder about, what am I missing? What am I not seeing? What's my filter? Is my attempt at countering those, default positions.
You have me thinking about just that, the power of transition when we're sort of going through it. It could be a simple example of this year, Sanji, we need you teaching 2 sections of geography, and you sort of you have that moment where you dig into what you assume is all you, and can I do this? Should I do this? Why are they doing this to me? Like, it's that you get into that gray zone of transformation, and I wonder about how resistant you were when you started to realize that you couldn't go back to a version of yourself, and you sort of had to move forward. And whether or not you have, can you speak to that? For me, if I were to sort of, if I take that in, for me, that's an emotional experience. When you realize you just, that's almost rite of passage. You can't go back to that version that you were. And whether or not you agree that you should move forward, you just realize that you can't be stationary. You're going to be pulled through to this next place. Right. Did you have a sense that you were changing towards something, or that you needed to leave stuff behind?
I think when you get to, I think I was at year 9 or 10 when this opportunity came. So, you've had a handle on the pedagogy. You've had a handle on assessment, but you also were noticing the shortcomings, right? So, thinking about the impact on students. I was starting to notice things like why were all the university classes there were fewer students of color and students from working class backgrounds, right? And even boys, right? It was dominated by girls and boys going into STEM sort of fields, and for you English was just a compulsory credit to get through, right? It wasn't engaging them. Right? So I was like, why is that? Is that by design? Is that by, intention? And then also the, I would say, the barriers to changing that from, other teachers, from even students and the community as well. And one of the things was at my previous school, there was a feedback from the parents that that English teachers in general at the school, the parents perceived as being gatekeepers because their students were excelling in all the so-called applied sciences and maths, but when it and doing quite well in terms of 90s and so on, but when it came to English, they could barely get a 75, right? So they were their career and or college aspirations or even scholarship opportunities were being jeopardized because they weren't getting the same results in English. And our first or my first response was to that, said, well, the problem is with the students, right? But then and I started to think about, is it? And I think that was the initial crack in the foundation of things. That
those moments are huge. I'm really lensing down on this. How was that brought to your attention? Because that's a major sort of like turn.
Sure.
To go from it's not about it's actually about how it's how they're learning, not how I'm teaching. And there's a whole lot of great quotes out there that talk about, those things have to be in harmony. Otherwise, most cases will side the teaching doesn't exist. That's what gets zapped out of that zero sum if there isn't something harmonious coming out of it. How is that brought to your attention? Because I will say, in connecting with other teachers that maybe are resistant to consider factors other than student agency and efficacy, to look back at themselves and their approach and their pedagogy. Right. You've mentioned before that the people that colleagues are an important sort of reflector for yourself. What were the discussions in the actual department looking like when you come to this realization? Because I've been in those meetings where you kind of like you're the one that becomes the outlier in the statement. Right. And it's sometimes, for me, so alt ed is my background, alt ed, spec ed, guidance. Right. And I was the foot and mouth every time, but sort of posing that question that either it was kind of new to me or it took on real new power to me. And I could tell when I posed it to the table of my colleagues at whether it was regional meetings or it was at department head meetings, they're like, oh, Clough. Really, but I think this is the question. This is the question we have to be asking, and everything just kind of goes. Right. You can feel just like that, the breaking going on. So for you to sort of arrive at this place, was there anything in particular, or was it just like observing the wellness of the kids? Like I have to make it about their wellness, not necessarily about their proficiency. Right. They're not flourishing.
Right. I think it was both feedback. Because again, I think in this profession, we've gotten away with perhaps not seeking feedback on our practice. That, it's something we do it to you, take it or leave it, the semester is over, right, off we go, right? So, and now we know, right, thanks to, equity educators and thinkers, that's impact. We never really assessed impact, and I still feel that, we're not fully reflecting on our intent and our impact. Right, but I didn't have that language back then, right? So to hear a guidance member or counselor say, the sense out there is that, English teachers are X, Y. That was a bit of a shock to the system, right? Because I had never sought that out before, and so it made me think, is it something I'm doing? We're doing, and the other part of it as well is that it was they were also leaving in droves. The students were looking for alternative opportunities for English, for you course, right? They were going to private schools, they were going to summer school. Again, something to be gotten over with versus to learn and become proficient in communication. So it was even self-serving in a sense that we were losing sections, right? And we're talking in a large school, upwards of 2 or 3 teachers in a large school that we should have, but we weren't because of the flight to anything but at the school, right? So thinking about all the opportunities, losing out on that as well, that they were voting with their feet, and we're finally starting to notice because somebody pointed it out. And the other part of it is that I thought I was equity minded. And yet, parents had this perception that we were gatekeeping, and the community that I taught at was highly diverse, and that really made me pause and think, perhaps I'm not as equitable as I think, when an entire community feels that there is a concerted effort to prevent their kids from being successful. Right, so there's something to, if there's a large group of people saying that, highly likely, right, there's something going on. So that was a beginning of the, as I said, the crack in the foundation. And so I am really mindful of seeking feedback and, always asking, how is it for the other person on the receiving end?
In teaching English, take that as one of your loves, one of your curricular loves, one of your life loves, wherever it sits in that love space for you. When you started, were you the teacher as you were the student when you were sort of taking those courses? So have you always taught secondary? Was that your so secondary?
I have, yeah.
So was there any, when you think back on let's say the experience that you were providing as the teacher, as the educator in the classroom, were any of the memories of you as the student developing your love for that craft? Was that informing your practice? So were you sort of like the teacher that you were the student?
Right.
Or did you feel at the time, the best example I can give for myself is that in high school was not high school was the work that I did to kind of get to my job, which was work in restaurants. So I sort of tolerated being in school, toed the line, got my marks, wanted to work in hospitality. When I came into teaching, I had a sense of I was going to be teaching, because I started off teaching hospitality, culinary in high school, and I was aware of almost instantly. I was aware of myself as a student in my own class. Didn't really gain anything out of it. It's not like I had this epiphany like, oh, I need to be a better teacher than what I had as a kid. But I had this sense of somewhere between nostalgia and deja vu, like how am I doing this differently than what I experienced?
Right.
You as a student in an English class back in the day, did you have a sense of, yeah, you know what, I'd kind of like to teach this? Or was there something different? How was EDU brought to you, and were you a different teacher than you were a student?
Well, I like to think so, because high school was utterly boring, and I like to think that because
for me,
exactly, so because we read Stone Angel and Fifth Business and King Lear, right? So The Great Gatsby, right? And because I had a particular, I guess, inclination for language, I got through it, right? Mm-hmm. And even, I would say mastered based on the marks I got, but I didn't get anything from it personally. Okay. But I was doing I was reading literature outside a classroom, mm-hmm. right? But that wasn't that didn't count. And then even further in university, I ate up post-colonial literature and feminist literature, and poetry and African history. So but then when I came back to teach in the school system, I was reproducing. Because first 5 years, as you know, is survival.
Yes.
Right? You just, thank goodness for corresponders. I'm just teaching, and I was LTO. I was working part-time, so I was just surviving and reproducing those things. And then after, you think you have a bit of a grounding, then you start to be like, let's start incorporating some, racialized voices and feminist voices. But yet, that's supplementary. Right, the core still remained, mm-hmm. right. The center still, still held, which was CanLit, Eurocentric, yes. right, curriculum for the most part, and then and because the resources existed, so for various reasons of convenience, practicality, legacy, you reproduce those, yep. right? But then, because I had a love of literature and especially imaginative literature, I made it work, right? Because I like to think I had a handle on, instructional efficiency and assessment. I still made it work. And, I inspired my students because I was highly motivated. I had personable relationships, I like to think anyway. I made it work. But again, I think in the daily grind of things, I'm not sure I stepped out to see or to ask, are they engaged by this? Are they transformed by this? Or are they going through the motions, right? So, I was teaching and they were studenting. And in terms of, assessment, the level 4s were level 4s that came in as level 4s, left as level 4s, the level 3s came in as level 3s, left as level 3s, and so on, right? So there was no progress as a result of my teaching. I'll put it that way.
And coming into teaching, what convinced you that you should pursue that? Was that an always dream to sort of?
It was. Again, because I loved language and literature and literacy, because that was my passion, I made it work, right? So even when I was reading in first year, Roughing It in the Bush, Susanna Moody, the, quintessential first tome of Canadiana, right? And where this, British immigrant woman is blatantly racist towards the squaw.
I feel like you're gonna, with that language in itself, you're gonna be triggering some listeners that are like, oh my God, I remember that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I made it work because I was like, I can get through this.
Yeah.
Because of my passion for literature, and I saw it as, I guess this is what you have to read in order to have an English degree in Canada from York University.
It's kind of an early sense of gatekeeper syndrome.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Early
because
sense
that's what. Right. That was what was prioritized. That was what was on the syllabi.
Yeah.
So that's what it was. Literature was characterized as. Mm-hmm. Right. So there you have it. Mm-hmm.
I think back to, I shared this story with you before about what I believe to be my first connection to you, which is a few years back. You may not remember, but it had to do with our board's, I think, formal step into modern learning, mm-hmm. and part of the branding of that approach of modern learning. And in my recollection is that you were part of the team. I'm not sure what, I don't know, I can't remember what part, from the introductions, but I do remember we were in this room.
Okay.
I think we were looking. We were in this room,
Yeah.
and at the time, the modern learning, when it was first ruled out, it was kind of pillared based. So here's what we're trying to kind of, and when I think pillar, I think either hold up or hold down or just structure, right? And we had the mathematics, and then we had modern learning, which was kind of multifaceted, and then we had our mental wellness.
Right.
And I can remember at the time, I was down with that because it was going to be like these think tanks to sort of just let's get some idea of what we're actually talking about here. The board already had kind of ruled out a framework, but we needed to fill it with some sort of ideas. Parallel to this, my stepfather at the time he's a Lutheran minister, he's now retired. And I can remember talking to him, so family get-togethers are problematic when he and I want to sit down because we kind of disappear. It's like, where have they gone? They're like off talking somewhere, right? And I can remember somehow we started to talk about that term modern learning came up. And he's an academic, he's a theologian, he's a pastor. He has a deep practice in his religious community. And it was fascinating to hear he kind of paralleled that with sort of like modern religious practice and what are sort of the expansion points? Like where does canon kind of stand in your way? Where is it so necessary to find some cracks? And where there are actually spaces to exist that people just don't want to kind of address. So we're kind of doing this education, spiritual, almost religious discussion about modern learning. And when I told him about the pillars that were a part of it, his response after some discussion and kind of working it through, and he had pushed back. He said, I'm curious about how those are kind of all drawn together as one. And it was fascinating because that wasn't a part of the discussion initially. We sort of had almost like staccato silos of each one. We're just going to develop each of these. That was my sense. Could have been different from the developer standpoint, but that was my sense that there really wasn't any connective tissue there. Flash forward to a discussion with Michelle Cassidy, and I had a conversation with her. And in the middle of that discussion, I had a sense, and I shared with her, I said, I feel like we're starting to get into sort of a synergistic space where these pillars mean something bigger when we're actually activating them all at the same time. So your mental wellness with your mathematics and your modern learning, the tools of modern learning. Going back to my father-in-law, where he said, because it was around that time, he listened to that podcast with Michelle Cassidy, and then he said, what about also within this, a sense of belonging? And and again, it's sort of, he put me in the middle of a conversation. I didn't have the tools to I couldn't extricate myself from it. It became very sticky, that idea of belonging, because I wanted to kind of say, is that mental wellness? Is that some of the new pedagogical strategies we're going to use it with math? Like I couldn't place it somewhere. And inevitably I started to kind of just wrap it around it. And I'm curious about your view on that, as that idea of belonging within a space, or belonging within, we could say a classroom, we could say belonging within the curriculum. It's kind of, we're edging up to sort of like culturally responsive practices across the board, but I really like that idea of belonging. And I haven't been able to let go of that idea when I think about what I want to challenge myself with, the equity work that I think is both interesting and necessary for me to get involved with. But modern learning and belonging.
Right.
What are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the modern learning frame at the inception was a manifestation of that academic rationalism, where the individual is kind of second, right? That the learner is the second thought, right? Where we privilege learning content, what's good, right? In terms of, after all, you can argue that schools are here to educate, right? But then again, we're also leaving out big pieces, right, of who the learner is, and that's that holistic whole child. So absolutely, I think, looking back, as I talked about shift from my, rational academic self to an equitable, reflective, critical practitioner, but it's still that we're still grappling and challenged by what it means to put the learner at the center and work outwards, right? So what will work for them rather than here are the structures, how can they fit? So that belonging, that mattering, that being who you are and bringing your whole self wherever you are as a learner, and not just as a learner, is that ongoing inquiry for us as a board. So we're grappling with few ideas, and one of them being inclusive design that centers the learner and designs outwards for what do they need to be successful, to be learned, to be balanced, harmonious individuals. And the other is culturally responsive practice. What does that mean? But again, legacies are hard to let go of, right? Because they're so ingrained. They're in the walls. They're codified, and that codification is doing things to people rather than with people or centering like learners. Is what I mean. So I think we're in, and the other part of it is that often we sort of blame the structures that we don't have control over that. It's beyond our spheres of control and influence. They are what they are, and we're at a point where we are challenging ourselves to think, but I'm not sure we're there yet. And that belonging and mattering is a serious question. It's a serious matter, and I'm not sure we have the answers. I think we are grasping for some things. There's some tangible things, again, theories and practice and mindsets. But that is the holy grail is again, how do we ensure that each learner feels they belong and they matter and they're able to reach their best selves. That sometimes has me keeping awake at night thinking about that, because part of again belonging to academic rationalist system, it was good enough that 70 to 80% of our learners were successful. It was good enough. We were doing our best as a large system, but the 20%, the so-called underserved and underperforming, right, which is new language for us, was again the way we perceived it, or I perceived it, was, well, the problem lies with the individuals, with their families, with their community, right? They don't appreciate education. They don't appreciate middle class, well-paying careers. They don't have the tenacity and the character traits to be resilient, right? So we kind of shamed and blamed, right? So now we're switching that. Is that as a system that serves the good people of Ontario, is it conscionable that we have students who are again failing, and to what extent is that our responsibility? So I don't have an answer for you, but I think we're at least having those conversations, which is a starting point. I don't know if that's a cop-out or not, but so. Well,
it kind of it sparks me to think of using the word grappling, and if I make that relational, it's, let's say, whatever you or I are grabbing onto, and then I think about what's grabbing me back. If we make like there's some sort of relationship there, it's not just a matter of, if we make it issue based, that you're grappling with an issue or an identity or a philosophy or like a moment. What's happening back to you as you actually try to sort of wrestle with this thing? For you, when it comes to, let's say, this sort of like culturally responsive process, whether it's the place that you're trying to sort of impact change on, or the actual framework of pedagogy, or the activities, the system, if we say, you can go one of two routes. One question, you can pick A or B if you want. What are you grappling with within this frame? What do you find is still like your pieces that you're really, as you say, keep you up at night specifically? And then the other one, the question that I'm asking, which is connected to my direct one to you, is it fair to assume that, is it fair to think that there are educators that their sense of belonging is part of what they're grappling with as well as they're trying to build a sense of belonging for their students? So what do you think?
Right.
You and what you're grappling with, or
Yeah.
your thoughts on
Right.
colleagues that are sort of now opened up to the possibility that they could ask that question, how do I belong in this exact same space?
Yeah.
What would you like to go out first?
I think I'd like to take a stab at both of them.
Okay, go ahead.
And one of them being that you're right. As adult learners, we're still learners. So, part of my team and my department's, I think, goal is to see, teachers as learners, and how do we, how are we responsive to their engagement and to their learning, which in effect will impact their learners, right? I think we can't separate the two, although, sometimes I do, think to myself, you're an adult, I shouldn't have to engage you, right? You're getting paid for this, right? And then I check myself and I think, your role is to engage adult learners, right? So that way they in turn will have those reflections of their practice, of their knowledge, and in turn impact their learners in classrooms. And so I think the what's good for one is good for the other is what I'm getting at. And in terms of that mattering and belonging is how are we also validating and acknowledging and celebrating our colleagues, right? Our frontline teachers, because, without a doubt, that's the number one thing that makes a difference in students' lives is teacher efficacy, right? Like take away everything, right? Modern classrooms, fancy technology, right? Gleaming buildings, stellar principals. They don't make that, they don't make even that much of a difference as teacher efficacy does, right? Like the literature is clear on that. So how do we get all teachers to be efficacious in that sense? That, so I think that's that mattering and belonging. Do our teachers and frontline staff feel valued, and that the work that they do matters, and that their supervisors or who have you value them, listen to them and their needs, are mindful of their needs. And the other side of that is, as teachers, again, is it enough that we do what we've always done? Because, sometimes you get the feeling that, well, it's just a job, right? And yet, the school system is one of the most, again, influential experiences in somebody's life outcomes, or everybody's life outcomes, right? Trajectory, right? It has the potential to marginalize, right? To oppress or to empower. I'm not sure all our teachers or colleagues are mindful of that. So my, thinking has been around how do I get them to empower them, perhaps, to see their work, their interactions with students as life-changing, right? When you're still bogged down with the daily minutia of things, right? Because when you're in the thick of it, sometimes you don't have the luxury of stepping out and reflecting, right? There are deadlines, there are lesson plans, there are marking, right? There are supervision duties, there's extracurricular activities, right? Like, the extent of responsibilities of a teacher are huge. right? So sometimes I think we can get into so that hamster wheel of doing that doesn't allow for the reflection, that critical reflection. Like, am I having positive impact? Are there things I'm doing that are oppressive, right? To kids, to families, to communities. So I think I guess to answer your question is, one, as somebody who's in a role to support teachers, I need to be mindful that I am treating them and working with them in ways that are equitable and culturally responsive. And I think my colleagues will also need to enter into that space of that critical, again, reflective practice by listening to voices, and asking, do they feel they belong? Do they feel they matter? Do they feel that when they're not there, that they're missed, right? Their presence is missed. And those are, I feel like, are new. They feel extra almost, right? In such a large system. My perception is, again, reflecting back as a teacher that I was in the classroom, you want me to, do all that I have to do instructionally and assessment-wise, and you want me to be critical of my practice, right? That would have seemed unreasonable at that time. Yeah. So I think my sense now is that, how do I be compassionate and be respectful of my colleagues and all that they accomplish, right? Because again, we are successful for 80% of our students. Our graduation rate is if it's an indication. But what about the other 20? And then of course, entering into that conversation or that dissection of that data of students who are unsuccessful, you see patterns emerging along lines of race, along lines of class, along lines of sexuality, right? That those are, social identities that are historically and repetitively are, again, underachieving or not achieving, right? So what is it that we can do to make a dent in those outcomes, where 100% of our learners are successful?
In another conversation with a colleague of mine, Sarah Vitelli, and we landed one of our pieces that we landed on, and I don't know if we got a firm grasp of it. It's ongoing discussion between us, talking about the idea of the opportunities to encounter incidentally identity. We talked a little bit about sort of from a system point of view, the ways that we can sort of mirror students' identities is through, groups and teams and clubs, and we can sort of say this is a great way for you to sort of experience school. I don't know if we specifically say this is a great way for you to kind of figure yourself out. There are some clubs that are more specifically, let's say, identity based, and then others that could be perceived to be more like sort of activity based. But we kind of landed on this, a bit of opportunism, as in without if you wanted to explore your identity as a chef and you weren't sure whether you wanted to declare it, and you decided to join the cooking club, there's pros and cons to being sort of like locked into a space where that's the only thing that is being discussed. So we started talking about where are the places where we can, and this was specific as well about equity work, where are we looking at some of the equity tools and the equity speak and the equity ideas and the opening up, being a part of all kind of spaces, so that if you are exploring versions of yourself, you could encounter them without commitment. You could encounter them without judgment. You could encounter them without having to say, I am even that right now. You just get to audit sort of elements of your life. And we sort of landed in a space like that would be kind of cool for students to be able to do that. It may even, in fact, encourage some students to sort of feel a little bit more liberated in how they can explore. You know, and again, not the system judging, saying this is how you have to do it.
Right.
This is just the opportunity. You go for it. And I really like that idea, and I find myself dancing between the implications of that and another thing that Sarah mentioned about whether or not us as educators, we have either an obligation or responsibility to kind of rock our truths in school to whatever level. I guess I won't even say the level, because to even say it suggests that there's a good, a bad, there's an actual percentage that should be. What are your thoughts on that as far as the teachers modeling? Because it's that I'm in that space right now of trying to figure out belonging. And if I had my father-in-law here, he'd be chiming right in about building community and the openness and the sit beside and the sort of like just the listening.
Yeah.
It's all about the listening. It's about the listening. What does that look like within schools where we're considering? Are we considerate enough in what we're paying attention to, as in creating opportunities for kids and colleagues to be able to sort of bring whatever it is that's in them that is their truth, without having any sort of rules about how you're welcomed into the space. So I'll back that one up a little bit. The idea of incidental identities, being able to run into and test drive versions of you. Educators with the obligation to kind of like rock their authenticity to whatever level they feel comfortable to, which could also be another version of that incidental identity. And then that kind of final space that rules about being welcome, as in I feel like I'm welcome, but as long as I kind of follow this kind of like path, I can be myself.
Yeah.
So now you get a 3 choice.
Oh, yeah. I mean, based on what I hear you're saying, that I'm not sure I agree that all, or your sort of what you're calling incidental identity, because some identities, whether you accept them or not, are still foisted upon you, right? So, to use myself as an example, homophobia towards me, and at that time I was questioning, and of course, it was risky growing up in the 90s. There were no GSAs, right, to be gay. Right, in a racialized body to boot. Right. So even though I rejected that identity, because of the risks that it involved, but I was still called gay or fag or what have you.
Yep.
Right.
Okay.
So so that I didn't have agency over that. So I think that's in a lot of the cases where it is a social identity and it's a visible identity. You don't have agency over what others call you or use to treat you.
Okay.
Right? So there's that part. And I think the answer to that, as you mentioned, is to how do you come to perhaps accept your identity, whether incidental or social identity where it's ascribed to you, is by having those opportunities, that myriad of opportunities that are affinity based. Right, so GSAs or equity clubs or national affiliation, ethnic affiliation, or what have you, because again, we're all sort of as Robin DiAngelo, who is an author, equity advocate and researcher, would call, we're all swimming in sort of racial waters. Right, where in our sense we're talking about the Eurocentric, right, white culture that we don't name, but we're all in, or Marie Baptiste, this Mi'kmaq scholar, calls that we're marinated in.
Yep. Right.
So, and that, but it's posited as the default, as the neutral, as the standard, right? So I think one of the things that we need to again grapple with and come to terms with is that there is a default, a standard in Ontario in the Canadian context, and that's whiteness and white culture. And that gives rise to the need for affinity-based right? Because if we don't belong to that identity group that is seen as a default, there is, impact on students, on teachers. And this is where I think we need to think about dismantling that to include multiple voices and decenter. And it's not to displace, because, scholars have talked about there is appropriate whiteness, right? It is destructive when it becomes the default, right?
I've never heard that term. It almost makes me. It doesn't translate well to podcast right now, but I'm smiling. I'm only smiling because I almost feel
about appropriate whiteness.
Yeah. That somehow just to even accredit
right.
whiteness with a level of propriety. I'm like, oh my gosh,
Right.
I would never think to myself to sort of like put a metric on it. I understand the perspective. I understand even, let's say, the necessity. I just it kind of.
Well, because, it sort of presupposes that just like I need to have pride in my, Tamil Sri Lankan heritage, you should be within your rights to have pride in your white identity.
I'm happy being
right?
me.
Right?
It almost feels like it's an accreditation that I am I'm not deserving of, only because I think of the space that my whiteness takes up. So in saying that there's an appropriate level, I don't take it as in I need to sort of pull it back or be anything less. I just like, it's sort of like I would have never, I fall on the other side of like, I don't, it's a measure of my own power and my sense of where I am centered that I would say to you, I don't think I need permission to be me. And I don't see rules around how I'm welcomed into a space. I just assume I can be there. I assume it without questioning.
Right.
And just when you said, that's what was catching me.
Yes, absolutely.
In that smile.
And that's because, often those that are early in their understanding of equity, often take offense that when we're talking about whiteness and white supremacy, it means that you can't be white. Like, that's not what it means. Right? It means that, given the, our history of colonization, colonialism, whiteness meant superiority over others.
Yep.
Right? Power over others without question.
Yeah.
Right? And that's how, Eurocentric society standards were established.
Yep.
Right? At the expense of indigenous, right, voice and culture and knowledge, at the expense of racialized peoples. Right, cultures, voices, and knowledge. So, just to almost like, allay those fears that we're not saying don't be white, right? We're saying be white, but in our society, they shouldn't be one center, right? They should be that plural space for all to coexist with full rights, with full, human rights and that equity and access to resources without privilege, right? Without advantages because you belong to, one category, whether it be whiteness, whether it be maleness, whether it be middle class and upper class, right? Status. But especially in a public system that serves and is funded by public dollars, right? We need to have, achievement and success and well-being for all people of society of all levels, right? Not just some or not most. Yeah.
I liked also as well in the when you. Appropriate level of whiteness. I have to say that there would be like a PD session, don't be white, would be very provocative indeed. Very provocative. It would shake up the thinking just a little bit.
Yeah.
Just a little bit. So the landing on the end of that sort of like 3-question buffet, the teachers sort of bringing their authentic to the workspace.
Yeah.
I do, and I shared a story in a previous podcast just about someone commenting on my hair being shorter than it had been before the Christmas break, the winter break there, coming back with a shorn head. And in that moment, this is when I talked about the rules of feeling welcome. I just made a note of it, is that for this person, the me coming back, or the me being there with the shaved head, was not the same me as the longer hair and I had a fuller beard. And I noticed it and kind of moved on. I didn't land there very long, but it was enough for me to notice that, again, for this person, there was an issue with
how you presented
with the body that was in the room at that point. And there was even a statement of how it would be better if I just let my hair grow now. and I'm not, again, it's an example where I noticed, because I know of broader conversations where this would be a really problematic and revealing conversation in other contexts, where you're sort of declaring that the person that's in front of you should actually be a different version of them, because they would be a more effective person in this space.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this was sort of brought to me about my haircut. Now, there's things about me that I remain open enough to colleagues and friends to sort of be able to either make jokes, or that collegiality comes with some, the joviality as well. So we were able to sort of play through that, and me push back, knowing that I couldn't say, you got to open your mind a little bit, because I could come into one with my eyebrows gone if I get bored. Like I'll do something just to sort of play with what the shell of the identity. And I take this example, and I kind of use it as an example, or it's a mirror for me that my mind is moving in the right direction when sort of checking my rules about welcoming people into a space, and that it can never be about what I perceive to be the better version of them that makes me more comfortable.
Right.
And again, my path of learning, what that means consistently is the work, it's the grind. Because it is very easy for me to present this theory to you based on one example. You do it again and again and again to establish the credibility that this is now me as a white male, middle-aged, as we declared on the front.
Short hair.
You self-identified, short hair, short hair, bearded, white male. We're pretty much the same, except for some really cool differences. Right?
Yeah.
So just before we wrap, just that idea of the educator kind of rocking their identity. And I know there's no single path to sort of finding, I'll come back to the belonging. I wonder about that exact same example, that individual talking to me about my cut hair, and I make a systemic stamp of that, where either said or unsaid, there's the sense that somehow there are rules to me being welcomed into the space. And I'm curious about your perspective on either kind of rewriting that, wrong word, writing a new path, because we can't deny, if we say that there are, if we agree that there are systemic values and perspectives and biases that are woven into the work that we do, the next step forward is how you affect the change. I don't think we can't pull out what has happened.
Correct.
What we do next can. What could be that next? What could be that next? And you had mentioned, making sure that we're respecting the multiple views, that we're sort of including more voices in there. But let's say we're just shifting a little bit from providing a context for a student. Now we're sort of talking about our colleagues. So the ones that might be either questioning or pursuing or kind of exploring themselves.
I mean, that's again, you keep asking all these $1 million questions, and I love that, because I don't have a full thought out plan. However, here's my stab at it, and that is even that bringing in your whole self, not just your self as a teacher, is relatively new.
It is.
Right? Where, for the reasons I mentioned, where there's risk or there's positional trust or lack thereof, you couldn't bring your full self, right? Especially, when I first started teaching, even though I was perceived as gay, I did my best to manage that identity, because I knew that it came with, bias, right? Whether in students, in colleagues, right, in community. Because at that time, we didn't talk about social identities. We didn't talk about, oh, it's okay to be gay. We didn't talk about it's okay that, English is your second language, that, you were an immigrant here and you learned and got an English degree, where there was a priority of native speakers, and there still is in lots of other parts of the world, where, in order for you to have credibility as an English teacher, you had to sort of front as, as somebody whose first language was English. That that was your natural, mother language.
You know what just came to mind?
Yeah.
Did you have to front the appropriate level of whiteness?
Right. Well, you know what? That's a good point. Absolutely. Right. Or at least, facsimile of it.
Yeah.
As close as I could get
Yeah.
to.
I
Right.
apologize. Sorry for the introduction.
No,
but
I think that's a great
I was
example.
like, I didn't know if we were sort of that
Right.
that stamp
Yeah.
was the exact same
Right.
thing, just
Yeah.
kind of flipped
Yeah.
from the perspective
Right.
of expectations, not offering.
Correct. The standard,
Yeah.
right? Like how close can you get to, right, as an English teacher, and what that,
Yeah.
prototype or archetype
Yeah.
of the English teacher was. So I think having those conversations about how we bring our whole selves, right, is a way forward. And also I think as teachers we can do more to learn about the notion of identity and not just your role impacting, right, your work. So I think we have a lot more work to do, or learning to do, perhaps even unlearning around power, privilege, and what does it mean to be, a Canadian? What does it mean to be white? What does it mean to be non-white? What does it mean to be racialized? I think we need to, because again, going back to how things were when I started, in 2004, those were impolite things to talk about, or they were radical things. Right? A few years in, we started having GSAs, and I remember we had to, meet secretly, right? Because we were afraid of blowback from the community, right? Things like that. So, what's the message to a gay teacher that, don't advertise a gay-straight alliance, right? Because, we're all going to hear about it, or we're going to end up on the news, right? So, and again, we're really early, I feel, in equity learning and unlearning, and maybe some relearning as well. So be open to those conversations, because a lot of us, because of our perhaps bias, perhaps lack of knowledge, that we shut down. Some of us still believe that equity is not really teaching, learning. It has no business in our system, right? So I think being open to new learning, and as I said, unlearning, I think is a way forward. And the other one is to listen to our stakeholders, right? Our students, our community, right? Our colleagues, and see if it's not working, what will work. Let's enter into a dialogue, right, and not a monologue about solutions. They may not all work, and that's the other part as well. We're afraid of failure, afraid to take risks, and yet we require those of our students all the time. But as a profession, as in our roles, we don't do that enough. What was the second part, or the last part of your question about going forward? And I feel like there was something else there that I missed that you were wondering about.
It was about that, being able to bring your whole self to the classroom, and the rules around being welcome. So it's almost like the rules about being welcome in a space is almost a bait and switch. The lip service for equity work.
Right.
that on one end you know that you can walk into a room, but then you see the experience of others and feel like you have to ask to participate in it, so to speak, or whatever that is being offered. Seems to be it's there for the taking, which is for me the wrong paradigm. That you feel you walk into a space and you have to, well, if I go back to where we started, your sense of your rational self competitiveness to have a mastery of the language that you felt would sort of accredit you with that appropriate level to the next step. It's belligerent in some ways, but only to the end of how it's being portrayed that you're going to be successful. You have to fight like that to get that, and then you observe the room. You're like, why is no one else having to fight for this stuff?
Right.
And so I think it's that, again, the rules around being welcomed into a space, which was sort of stemming out of a very simple and silly thing, my head being shaved. But it got me thinking about that, right? And then what am I doing in spaces to have the welcome just that? It's just making the room open. It's not setting a context as in you will be more welcome as long as you.
And I think you're also pointing to that advocacy and allyship, right? So, if you are, at the table and you notice voices missing at the table, you leverage your power to say, hey, why isn't so-and-so here? Why don't we hear from, right? And there we're being an ally by advocating for other people, for speaking up, right? And the other part of it is that just because you're at the table doesn't mean as well that you're being heard, right? So how do we also see through, false pretenses of inclusion, right? Inclusion means that, your voice is listened to and it has a bearing on the outcome. So I think just looking out for each other in that sense, and again, going back to that notion of pluralism is, what are we missing, right? What perspective is missing, or what are we not considering?
Yeah. I do. I remember when I sent you the frame for the conversation. You threw me an LOL. How long is this conversation going to be?
Right.
Let's return to it.
Yes.
You want to return to it? Let's return to it at some point.
Sure.
I think that there's a lot of openness in it, as far as things that I would like to come back to be able to sort of share more on the ground some of the work. Where I say the grind of the consistency, sort of like when I say that, me in the classroom, you not in the classroom, sort of working with, you're working with teachers and you're working in the consultancy realm, sort of like with the school board. I would love to come back to it at another point, just to sort of take another little litmus of kind of where things are going. And definitely next time around, it almost felt one-sided, as in I was asking you all these questions, but to sort of come back and sort of, I would like to be able to speak to some of the steps that myself and my colleagues are taking within the schools to sort of work on, because the questions and the frames that I offered you are coming from discussions that we're having in the school, and they're coming from a collection of educators, a broad collection of educators that are interested in sort of like creating these open opportunities for students to see themselves and to sort of create or recreate themselves, or just honor what they got, just to be able to sort of be themselves as they are.
Yeah, I think I definitely welcome that. I think we also owe it to ourselves and the system to speak of tangible things, right? That the specificities and the details, absolutely, because that's what actually when it matters to the lives of our students, right? Is that what are we doing differently? What's shifted, and how has that changed the experience when students are sitting down at tables or standing up or what have you? Yeah, absolutely.
So the mistakes made within those sort of reasonably vulnerable moments.
Yes.
And let's speak of those as sort of like the steps towards something
again,
without theory.
Absolutely, and because we tried something,
right?
It didn't work.
I like that.
But as opposed to, and again, especially in this work in terms of transforming systems and operationalizing equity, there's a lot of risk because we're talking about people's lives and their sense of self and how they feel about their place in learning and in schools. So But the opposite is inaction, right? Where we're just perpetuating status quo, and we know that's not working, right? It's not working for a lot of our families, a lot of our kids. So we owe it to them to say, this is what we're doing, this is our plan, and this is how it's panning out. Or, we now know that doesn't work, but here's what we're doing. Absolutely.
It's a curious way to look at equity work, as in having the permission to make mistakes towards.
Yes, absolutely.
It's sort of like equitable spaces.
I mean, it's not reckless, of course.
No, definitely not reckless.
Right.
But I really do think that there's, in order to get to that sense of agency, there's a strange two-step of feeling like we're giving ourselves permission to make these mistakes, because in doing so, we're increasing potentially. There's the potential to increase the transparency, to increase the engagement, to sort of increase the intentionality that we're, as you said, moving towards something. I use the example of watching the YouTube videos about, building a shed. At some point, if you don't go and spend some money, buy some resources, and start banging some nails into something, to watch one more video to refine your skill set. And sometimes I think about within our the way that the information is brought to us and the way that we're trained in the equity work. I almost feel like at some point there should be a whistleblower and say, now get to it, go try this, and then we'll come back to this. We'll come back to the part one, the part two, once you go out there and you kind of mess around a little bit. Because I think there's probably some psychological disorder about watching how-to videos, that at some point you convince yourself you're actually doing something more than watching YouTube.
Absolutely. And I think it's a form of, again, self-preservation as well.
Of course.
Right?
Of course.
So
we want to feel good about the work that we're doing, and maybe a little less good about the work that we're not doing.
Correct. Absolutely.
Sanji, thank you for the conversation.
Oh, thank you, Chris.
One last thing.
Sure.
If people are, when people reach out, where would you like to be found? So if they want to chase this conversation and reconnect with you, do you have...
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Twitter is my go-to. I try to, check that regularly and spend it, that's my, learning for the day, 10, 15 minutes on Twitter. So Sanj Siva 108, that's my handle on Twitter. That's SANJ SIVA 108.
Fantastic.
On Twitter, yeah.
I'll add it to the notes too.
Please do.
And thank you for the talk.
Well, thank you. I love these moments because I think it gives me an opportunity to clarify my own thinking and because you don't get to do that sort of on your own. You sort of think about it, but to articulate it, it goes a long way. So I appreciate your thoughtful questions.
And I appreciate you. Thank you for your time.
All right. Awesome.